Sveiki, mėly parakomanai, su jumis aš Alminas Sinevičius ir jūs žiūrite Lock and Loaded Patrulio Bazę. Šiandien turime garbingus svečius ir pakalbėsime apie, iš tikrųjų, apie Rusijos karą ir visą vykstantį karą Ukrainoje, Rusijos agresiją. Tai dabar kalbėsiu angliškai, nes mūsų svečiai yra nelietuviai. So, our topic is dynamics of Russian military capabilities. So I'm glad to present and to have here two our guests. First is Sidharth Kaushal, from Senior Research Fellow from Russia, and also James Sherr, Honorary Fellow at Institutional Center for Defense and Security. How you see Russian armed forces involved after beginning of the large-scale operation or aggression on Ukraine, so from 2022?
Sure. So I think maybe it's useful to begin with the army that went into Ukraine. And essentially what this was an army that was optimized for readiness at the expense of scale. So if you look, it was the product of the 2008 Georgian War, where the Russians had succeeded in a limited operation against Georgia, but had shown some major weaknesses in terms of generating forces at high readiness at speed, amongst other things, including coordination. And so the decision was made to trim down the Russian force structure in several ways. Divisions were replaced with brigade-centric force structures, and within individual motor rifle brigades, an emphasis was created on battalion tactical groups. Essentially, because a motor rifle brigade is a hybrid structure comprising conscripts and contract soldiers, the emphasis on BTGs was to ensure that an element of the brigade, usually battalion-sized, 1 to 2 battalion-sized units, could be maintained at high readiness at all times, and enablers that would typically be held at higher echelon were pushed down under the control of these battalions. So you had very heavily enabled but quite small units that could be brought to readiness quite fast and pushed in to secure limited aims. So this was
conceptually is a little bit like a NATO way.
A little bit, yeah. And in many ways, Russian warfare in this period was inspired by what Russian thinkers through the 1990s had seen as the fundamental roots of NATO's, or I should say NATO members' successes in wars such as, Desert Storm, as well as the wars that accompanied the breakup of Yugoslavia. And as you say, part of it was high readiness, very heavily enabled forces. It was also a heavy emphasis on non-contact warfare, so the use of long-range precision fires to fragment an opponent's command and control structures in the deep areas. Now, this worked quite well when the Russians were fighting on a limited scale. For example, in the Donbass or in Syria. But once the Russians started a war on the scale of their invasion of Ukraine, what they found was that a force optimized for readiness in this way had some pretty significant structural weaknesses. First of all, it was just too small to sustain some of the losses that are inherent to warfare at this level of scale. They also found specific organizational problems with the BTG, namely that the number of capabilities pushed down to the battalion level was simply too big for the staff of a battalion commander to handle, which is fine when you're pushing on a quite limited, narrow front to secure specific aims, but is much harder when you're in a fluid and dynamic situation on a front that extends over 1,200 kilometers. And so slowly you see the limitations of this model exposed, perhaps most starkly during the Kharkiv counteroffensive of 2022, where the entire grouping of Russian forces in that area is so heavily undermanned that it essentially collapses. So after this, the Russians make a number of shifts to their approach. on the front line, their model shifts back in some ways towards something resembling a divisional structure, at least at the level of command and coordination. And at the tactical level, BTGs are replaced with reinforced companies, which become the primary unit of advance for the Russian army. In terms of the quality of force, you see a sort of tiered structure emerge, where the remnants of the contract army, as well as the better assault units like the VDV and the naval infantry, are joined by large numbers of mobilized soldiers, as well as really expendable units. So, prisoners, for example, who were tempted to service by initially Wagner and then by the Russian government directly. And so the Russian model shifts to an effort to leverage the advantages that some of this very cheap, expendable mass provides. And the best example perhaps is, Bakhmut, where they sustain disproportionately high losses compared to the Ukrainians amongst attacking Russian troops, but the Russians are to a great extent expending convicts, whereas the Ukrainians are expending trained and therefore more valuable soldiers. By contrast, line infantry and assault infantry, the remnants of the VDV and naval infantry, are used very sparingly and only where either a breakthrough is perceived, a possible breakthrough, or where an opponent's breakthrough needs to be contained. So the structure shifts very much in the direction of mass on the front lines. In terms of Russia's deep strike campaign, you have a similar shift from an initial focus on using quite expensive, exquisite capabilities like the Caliber and the 9M723 Iskander against select targets, so command nodes and airfields, to a much broader strike campaign that includes, critical national infrastructure and a broader target set that has as its goal not necessarily overwhelming an opponent's defenses by shock and awe, as with the early Russian concept, but rather eroding it, literally running down its interceptor stockpiles. And in order to achieve this, the Russians mix expensive capabilities with much cheaper systems like the Shahed 136. So in the rear area as well, the Russian effort kind of shifts from one based on maneuver to one based much more on erosion and attrition. So I think those are the two. So broadly speaking, that's how the Russian force structure evolves in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine.
Returning to February 2022, this entire force structure and this entire scheme of operations is predicated on a fundamentally erroneous understanding of the adversary Russia is confronting. Sidharth rightly mentioned the parallel with Georgia, but of course there is no parallel with Georgia. The expectation was that shock and awe, a multiple axes of surprise, brutal, disruptive strikes would fragment the state and bring about its collapse. And of course amplified by the fact that special forces are tasked with wiping out the state leadership of Ukraine within the opening period of the war. Well, this unraveled very swiftly. They were actually, in my view, this was a structure which might have been optimal for achieving minimal, specific, limited aims against a very weak opponent, but
so
not
like in Afghanistan, because it could be some similarities, or you don't see?
No, I don't. That's a totally different situation. Sidharth rightly mentioned Georgia as a parallel, and I think Russians were assuming Ukraine would be like another Georgia. The Russians assume they know Ukraine better than anyone. They know Ukraine worse than anyone, but that's a separate subject. What they were trying to do was achieve maximal aims with a force structure that was originally devised to achieve minimal aims against a far weaker opponent than Ukraine. So that is why they needed to revisit their entire concept of operations. And if there was a mistake on the part of the Ukrainians in the early stages, it was in allowing the Russian forces that were initially deployed to withdraw in large part in good number and in good order and be reconstituted for the second stage of the war, that Sidharth has outlined and explained.
So about the fourth generation model that they, well, during the years, 2 years mainly, they established you mentioned already the volunteers, prisoners, Wagner that James mentioned. So it's like a mix of very different like types of people that is mobilized, so how you see it's working or not working for Russia, or maybe some thoughts on that?
So, yeah, initially, I think one of the big challenges Russia has had, because it in some way self-consciously dismantled the Soviet legacy system that was built to mobilize large numbers of people, is that the infrastructure to turn either volunteers or mobilized personnel into combat-ready soldiers doesn't really exist. So most basic training, for example, occurs within units, not in a centralized basis, and that's obviously very difficult when those units are deployed and not in a position to conduct training. Many of the academies that existed to train officers at a junior level were shuttered as part of the Serdukov reforms. And so initially the Russians had to be quite selective about who they called up, because they had to find people who required minimal training in order to ensure that they could be pushed into units as quickly as possible. So veterans of previous wars, that sort of thing. And they identified about 1.6 million such people who could be initially enticed to service by the offer of very high salaries and then just called up as part of mobilization. Now that quite selective approach to calling people up helped the Russians elude some of the challenges that their own dismantling of the Soviet legacy system created. But there was still a gap in terms of, competence and capability between, older veterans and people who were used to handling newer modern equipment. So the Russians still had to adjust their force structure and their tactics a bit. And that challenge only became more acute once mobilization waves brought in even less experienced people, and obviously once the Russians started to rely on even less reliable labor, so prison labor being the obvious example. I think the Russians have made it work in the sense that they have found a way to combine sort of fairly capable assault troops from the VDV and naval infantry, as well as the remaining line infantry they have, with mobilized forces in a way that does create a whole that's somewhat more than the sum of its parts. For example, using really low quality troops as a means of exhausting higher quality units, or as a means of unmasking units and forcing them to light up. So I think tactically the Russians have managed to combine these different units or these soldiers of varying quality to reasonable effect. But I think the bigger issue the Russians face is that the command and control structures needed to coordinate warfare at the scale that we're seeing in Ukraine doesn't necessarily exist within the Russian armed forces. And so this is part of the reason why when we see assaults by the Russians, they're fairly limited company-sized assaults localized on a particular part of the front, because really that's what the span of control of the Russian force is in many areas.
Force structure that emerged after the initial setbacks, but particularly in 2023, is in significant part also the leadership's response to internal imperatives in Russia itself. Putin's determination not to completely overturn the social contract he's had, particularly with the ethnic Russian population. You stay out of the state's business. The state, broadly speaking, will leave you alone. You can, in your private and economic pursuits. Still, the initial mobilization, selective as it was, the results alarmed him. The mass exodus to borders that occurred. And it was a warning to him, we're not going to do this again. It is also a testament to their ability to improvise. Wagner is a classic example of this. Prison's a classic example. But thirdly, what you see in this is an absolute determination to spend whatever is necessary, irrespective of the consequences for the economy, in order to accomplish these military objectives. So when you are talking then about paying ordinary kontraktniki, contract servicemen, monthly salaries of $2,000 to $8,000 a month, these are colossal sums of money in Russia, and death benefits to families and so on. So this is very astute, very adroit responses to circumstances of a more structural kind that the leadership is not willing to challenge. The point that Sidharth just made about the limitations and deficiencies of the command structure plays into a broader point that the structure and the background and understanding that the Soviet armed forces had about the conduct of operations at truly operational scales, wars of maneuver and combined arms, that these are not reflected in the current structure and in the current approach, which is an approach predicated on incremental successes in attritional war. And that approach is also predicated on a set of assumptions, but the main assumption is that with all the losses, by these means, we will gradually wear down the adversary and eventually crush the adversary and demoralize and dishearten the adversary's principal supporters in the West. So these are the premises and these are the constraints within which this strategy unfolds.
The other question, so we talked about the manpower, about the people in Russia. But what about the industry? Because there was also struggles after, well, at the end of 2022, I think it started, that they need to rebuild the Soviet Union times industry in some kind of way. And people, they working like in 3 shifts even in some of the factories. So, and the logistics. So it's a little bit merging, the industry and logistics, that those APCs, tanks and everything that's going to the front from Russian side. So what the challenges here could be for Russia, and how they can manage it, or how they managing it?
Yeah, no, you're right. So I think the Russian defense sector's capacity to scale, I mean, the fiscal challenge the Russians have managed quite well, but I think their major challenges will be in the area of labor. The Russians face a pretty tight labor market with a substantial labor shortfall. So the defense sector will compete for labor with other sectors that are also now paying high salaries to compete with relatively scarce labor. But there's also a question of suitably qualified personnel, because the defense sector is in all senses an aging sector in Russia, and that includes its human capital. Because of the lull in employment during the 1990s and early 2000s, many of the people who were doing jobs during that period stayed on, but were not necessarily replaced by younger counterparts. And so in a number of sectors, particularly shipbuilding, but not exclusively, the average age of workers is pretty high, and that, brings issues when it comes to things like retirement, but also how much you can squeeze out of an individual worker. Even so, they've, as you said, moved to a 3-shift model, and they have incentivized sort of employment through things like financial incentives. But there's a hard limit they're facing. And I think you see that in terms of, for example, tank production, where the Russians delivered 1,500 tanks to their front line this year, but only 200 of those were manufactured. The remainder were refurbished Soviet-era tanks. So I think, finding the labor is going to be one challenge, but also the fixed capital needed to produce additional infrastructure. So, land for additional facilities, for example, or the production of those facilities. These things are in some ways going to be much harder for the Russians to deliver than actually finding the money to finance the sector. So I think the defense industrial sector will represent a bit of a bottleneck for the Russians, especially past 2025, when they can no longer rely on the ability to refurbish Soviet equipment. This being said, their production has scaled up in a number of areas, most notably when it comes to precision-guided munitions and deep strike capabilities. When you look at missiles like the KH-101, for example, production of those missiles has, I think, over trebled over the course of the war. So it's certainly not the case that the Russian defense sector is stagnant or shrinking. Its capacity is growing, but not at the rate it would need to meet the Russian army's requirements, sans refurbishment of Soviet capability, as well as the ability to leverage Russia's partners like Iran and North Korea for things like shells.
Russia has received pitifully small returns, in my view, for all the extra resources they have put into the defense sector. And the fact that it has produced the results that Sidharth mentioned, meager as I think they are, stems overwhelmingly from the external factor, which has been a critically enabling factor in this war. China, according to the published intelligence assessments I have seen from more than one country in NATO, is supplying Russia, the defense industrial complex, with up to 70% of its machine tools and 90% of its microprocessors. I think the total of artillery shells supplied by now by North Korea is over 4 million, if I'm not mistaken. The fact that 25% of them explode in the gun barrels is noteworthy, but the general conclusion is the same. Without all of this, Iran's contribution is also critical, particularly if you are talking about attacks on counter-value targets and infrastructure. Without all of this, I do not think today Russia would be in a condition to prosecute this war at all. I'm not saying they couldn't prosecute a defensive war, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an offensive war. So now add something else to it. The defense minister who came into post after the Georgian War, Serdyukov, restructured defense industry in such a way that it became, by design, highly dependent in certain areas on Western-supplied subcomponents, which were possible to acquire through totally legal methods in those days, so that by the time you reached 2022, the Western content in Russian-produced weapons and weapon systems was quite high. Now, when people say sanctions have no effect, and this is a completely separate subject, they need to take into account the opportunity costs in economic terms, not only of circumventing these sanctions, but substituting Western components with other components manufactured elsewhere. Yes, it can be done, but it's very expensive, and what they're getting in exchange is not necessarily equivalent in quality. This affects reliability. It affects all kinds of issues. So I think this is the defense sector is at least as much a source of weakness as a source of strength in the Russian war effort. And meanwhile, Ukraine's defense sector is, whatever one says about its scale is appreciably greater than it was in 2022. And I'm not going to risk quoting an incorrect figure, but by an order of magnitude. But its innovative capacity has been remarkable. Ukraine is using weapon systems now that even a short time ago it didn't have, and would have made it totally dependent upon Western systems that the West is refusing to supply. So it's an extraordinary picture that presents Ukraine in a far more favorable light and Russia in a far less favorable light than most people suppose.
Okay, thank you. That's a good, very interesting corners that you're touching. So regarding all these things that we talked in the first question, well, broad question. So what do you think? What realistically could Russian armed forces accomplish in Ukraine? So finalize Luhansk and Donetsk regions, occupation of these regions, or maybe go up to the Dnipro River. So what is the possibilities or perspectives? I know that it's a very complicated question for academics, but still, let's...
It's a simple question. The answer is not simple.
Well, yeah. So maybe who wants to start?
Yes. The answer to this question does not depend on Russia itself. In some respects, it depends least of all on Russia. But let's first talk about the part that depends upon Russia. If you look at Russia's greatest victory at the time when the supply of US weapons was cut off by the US Congress, which was Avdiivka, there's in Bakhmut, the Russian losses were calculated to be roughly on a par of what they suffered in Afghanistan. As with the case in Bakhmut, they were not able to exploit that victory to achieve operational gains. They haven't exploited any victory to achieve operational gains. And even during the time when no US weapons were being supplied to Ukraine, Russian advances were only marginally more successful and deeper than they were before, and that they have been since. So, without a game changer in the West, which Putin is possibly looking for in November this year, I think it is most unlikely, certainly by the end of this year and the foreseeable future, that Russia is going to be able to secure by force of arms those territories that they have already declared to be legally annexed. Add to which, by the way, that Crimea is being made very hazardous for the conduct of military operations by Russia and for the stationing of Russian naval forces and many other forces. And the Ukrainians are demonstrating we don't need to reoccupy Crimea, invade Crimea to neutralize its significance. Its significance is greatly diminished. But it so much depends on what is going to happen. And obviously, if through one reason or another, whoever wins the November elections, the United States decides that there will be no more weapons supplied to Ukraine. And what is more, we're going to insist upon a negotiation, and we're going to insist Ukraine make major territorial compromises. Then, of course, Russia will be able to accomplish its objectives.
Yeah, I mean, I'd second most of what's been said. I suppose my one sort of addition would be, I suppose what the Russians are banking on is that, as James said in a previous answer, you know, attrition rather than territorial change is the relevant metric of success. And with a number of limited attacks across a broad front, as well as a deep strike campaign, what they're calculating is not necessarily that they will inflict more attrition than they themselves sustain, but they inflict more attrition and erode more capacity than the Ukrainians can necessarily replace, either in the form of human capital or in the form of capabilities such as air defense interceptors, where, you know, stockpiles pretty much everywhere are relatively low, and where production is constrained by bottlenecks in key long lead items. Now, whether or not that theory of victory succeeds, I think, will depend partially on decisions made within Ukraine regarding how it raises additional manpower for the front, partially on defense industrial mobilization in the West, because, you know, issues like the stockpiling of long lead items can be solved if defense industry believes they have the certainty of demand that they need in order to build up their inventories. So I think Russia's attritional theory of success is plausible, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be successful. That there is, there's more than enough room for maneuver in the West to constrain and entirely invalidate it. If the Russians do succeed in inflicting more attrition than the Ukrainian military can sustain, either in rear areas or closer to the front, they could see compounding gains, particularly in the next year or so, which could see them, at a maximal level push towards, as you said, either the boundaries of the Donbass or further towards the Dnieper. If they fail, however, past 2025, they are going to face some challenges of their own because they're sustaining more attrition than they inflict, but also, as we mentioned, their defense industry can't keep equipping new units. Thus far, they've had to rely primarily on a stockpile of Soviet-era capabilities that they have refurbished and pushed out to the front. But that stockpile will likely last them, according to most analysis, for the duration of this year on offensive activity. Past that point, their own defense industry's limited capacity to produce new platforms and the absence of, older kit to refurbish will significantly constrain their own capacity to mount offensive operations. So I guess the short answer would be there's all to play for. Sort of the Russian theory of success is plausible in this year, but if it's thwarted past this year, they will face some compounding difficulties in the years to come.
So then I will come back to James, that he said that center of gravity in this year for have some changes on the front. So it's mainly elections in the United States. Then.
Yeah, assuming no change in Western policy, let's assume that. I entirely agree with with all its qualifications, the trajectory that Sidharth has outlined. But one has to add one other point. Ukraine has its own theory of victory, and it is trying to shift the center of gravity of this war from those areas where it finds itself at a disadvantage, mainly, as you have said, for manpower reasons, to areas that are completely underdefended and unprotected in Russia itself. The Kursk operation is the most spectacular. The targeting and increasingly strategic scales of targets of increasingly strategic significance to Russia, inside Russia. The limitations on Ukraine are the fact that its principal strike weapons have a very low velocity compared to the weapons they are seeking, and their explosive power is quite limited compared to the weapons that they are seeking. But they're striking very deep and very important targets, and so far their capacity to do this seems to be outpacing the expectation. And the Russians have not been prepared for any of this at all. And they don't seem to be preparing themselves very well. The targets about the deadlines imposed on removing Ukrainian forces from Kharkiv, from Kursk, are at least as unrealistic, more unrealistic than those that have been the deadlines that have come and gone repeatedly in Donbass. So there is no sign that the state is somehow consolidating to produce an answer to these to this conduct of operations increasingly that is increasing in Russia itself. And my last point would be this. If the West were de facto to abandon Ukraine, simply by putting all its eggs in the negotiating basket, winding down the supply of weapons, and so forth, it would be an egregious error to suppose the Ukrainians will stop fighting. And they will fight in a way they find most to their advantage, whether we like it or not, irrespective of what the consequences are to us. and how disturbing and how unpredictable they might be. And they will be very unpredictable because they're determined to survive, and I think they have the wherewithal to do so. And if for some reason they don't, they will go down in a way which will severely cripple Russia itself.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, well...
I thought that was the last question. I'm sorry.
No, but
that's why I replied with such finality.
No, it's good.
It was an excellent
But now we will have this finality. So, well, it's maybe not appropriate to compare it with the NATO, nowadays Russian armed forces. What is the capabilities to start this kind of full-scale operation in the territories of NATO countries?
I know what I'm going to say, but it best follows what the points I suspect you are going to make.
So, I mean, the first thing, of course, is at the moment there's virtually no spare capacity in the Russian military, given the the scale and the demands of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and the fact that Russia simply can't run two concurrent operations. If the guns go silent or the conflict in Ukraine shifts to a lower level of intensity in the near future, I'd say in the very short term, Russia's capacity for military action on NATO territory would be quite limited. However, there are a couple of medium-term trends which are of concern. And the first would be that come 2027, there seems to be a growing analytical consensus in the United States that an invasion of Taiwan is plausible. Now, if that happens, America will in the Pacific face something it never faced in the 20th century, which is a military competitor that roughly equals it in GDP, depending on how you count, and probably exceeds it in industrial capacity, and is, at least in certain respects, a technological peer. The removal of American capability in Europe would have significant ramifications, perhaps most notably in the area of suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD, where we are to a great extent, Europe has the platforms, but we're to a great extent dependent on American munitions and American planning in order to achieve credible SEAD. If a Russian integrated air defense system around its armed forces cannot be adequately attrited in a conflict at relatively rapid pace, some of Russia's advantages in terms of ground-based firepower and sheer mass could well begin to compound. Not because Russian troops are of especially high quality, we've seen that they aren't, but simply because they are able to expend resources at a scale that we can't. To use one example, a senior officer of the British military noted that the intensity of fighting in Ukraine would have eroded our army's warfighting stocks in just over a week. So the challenge of capacity, I think, will become a pressing one in Europe, unless we can bring air forces, which are our great offset to Russian mass, into play. And that means relying on the Americans less for SEAD. The second challenge I would note emerging come 2030 is the issue of nuclear deterrence in Europe, because really the American deterrent is still the backbone of European deterrence, which is sufficient under current circumstances. But by 2030, if China fields 1,000 nuclear warheads, as the Pentagon estimates it will, and if American planning assumptions for nuclear deterrence, which is maintaining the capacity for damage limitation if a nuclear conflict does break out, which does involve destroying quite a lot of an opponent's warheads on the ground and at sea if possible, if these still remain planning assumptions, two-theater nuclear deterrence against two nuclear peers will become increasingly difficult. And there is a question then of whether Russia perceives itself as having a theater-level nuclear advantage in Europe, because the American nuclear deterrent is spread thin. Again, there are ways to resolve that, not necessarily by nuclearizing all of Europe, but for example, by using conventional deep strike capabilities as an offset, to use one potential example, but it's a challenge that will have to be addressed. So I guess the answer is, to your question would be, in the short term, I see no major Russian threat to Europe, but in the medium term, towards the end of this decade, I could see an emergent threat resulting as a combination of American distraction in the Pacific and shortfalls in key capability areas, the capacity for suppression of enemy air defenses being, to my mind, the most pressing conventional shortfall.
Again, I have no wish to challenge any of that I have heard. I agree with it. I agree with that assessment. What needs to be added, though, is that however long the period of Russia's forced reconstitution might be, which, as Sidharth said, has many different dimensions and hinges also on relative assumptions about what is happening at the same period of time to Western and particularly American military power and its deployment. If Russia succeeds by its own lights in emerging victorious from the war in Ukraine, which is to say, and I think it is very important to emphasize this, securing territorial losses by Ukraine underpinned by agreement with Ukraine's Western partners, and also underpinned by assurances to Russia in written form that Ukraine will remain a non-aligned state. What I think we can look forward to very swiftly is a very menacing expansion of what we inadequately call hybrid war. The reason it's inadequate, when people think about hybrid war, most people, and I include people who run committees of the US Congress and British Parliament, they're thinking of they're making three mistakes. They're thinking of something that is separate from the real future kinetic war, whereas a lot of what we call hybrid actions are designed to prepare the battlefield for a future war, so they are part of the whole spectrum of conflict. Secondly, because people think it's soft war, and they mainly discuss it in terms of disinformation. But it goes well beyond that. And it goes well beyond penetration and recruitment either. We are talking about disruption, destabilization, sabotage, assassination, simple acts of murder, and unattributable attacks on strategic infrastructure and communications cables, including those under the Atlantic Ocean. Now, but all of it designed to be, and with good plausibility could be, unattributable, given the fact that we are still operating until we are in an Article 5 situation, unfortunately, under peacetime legislation and peacetime norms of what states and armed forces can do. So strong circumstantial evidence, reasoned suspicion, all the rest of it, analytical certainty is not enough in most NATO, amongst most NATO allies, to take the action required, both to respond and to deter these kinds of actions from taking place and expanding. This is a relatively new, enlarging, exceptionally menacing dimension of threat that we are not looking at in a coherent and strategic way. And we need to do this many yesterdays ago, because if this war ends unfavorably, we can expect an expansion and escalation of this activity on every available front.
Okay. So that concludes our discussion. A very big thanks for you, gentlemen, for participating, sir. Thank you. Ačiū gerbėmiems žiūrovam ir susimatysime kitose laidose. Viso geriausio.